Hello Animals fans and welcome back to AniLysis. Today we're looking at Planet Ket. Now there's a lot of, I think, intrigue around this particular planet and the well, not so much foreshadowing, but further down the line. But today we are looking strictly at the planet, not the Ketrans, which are these creatures here. By the way, great drawing by Monster Man, always a great Animorphs artist, and that is a depiction of Ket with the Ketrans. So we're not talking about the Ketrans per se. We're not necessarily talking about individual crystals. We're just talking about the planet, how it's structured, what sort of life it holds. And so it's not going to cover too much this, but let's get into it. Let's cover the basics of Planet Ket, which has a funny name when you consider what else shares that name. But let's go into it. Firstly, why is it called Ket? I am a Ketran. My planet is called Ket. I mention this self-evident fact only because of the plans to open our Uninet to visiting off-worlders. So there you go, it's pretty straightforward. The planet Ket hosts the intelligent life, the Ketrans. So a lot of creatures or alien races tend to be named after their planet, assuming they're the dominant life form, which is why I've seen the name Andal floated around as the name for the Andalite homeworld, and I've subsequently used that name in my own fan fiction. The Andalites live on Andal, the Ketrans live on Ket, the Earthlings live on Earth. Although technically the Earth should be called Human, or Hume. We are humans from the planet Hume. That's what it should be, honestly, if we're to follow those guidelines. But that's sci-fi for you. So that is Planet Ket, host of the Ketrans. And we mentioned off-worlders there. And we actually go into a little description about the off-worlders and what they saw when they first came to this planet. So let's explore this planet from an off-worlder's point of view. Off-worlders are usually astounded by the facts of life on my planet. It's fascinating to speak with them because they can give you such a new perspective on what seems so normal to us. The earliest generation 9561s who arrived to investigate Ket failed even to notice us at first. Oh, they noticed the crystals, of course. They weren't blind. But it never occurred to them to look for intelligent life anywhere other than on the planet's surface. The surface of Ket is quite inhospitable to most life forms, covered as it is by acid seas, lava flows and strangle vines. But Generation 9561 were gamely wandering around in environmental suits, taking samples when one of their air skimmers accidentally ran smack into a mast of the Great Southern Polar Crystal, and a first contact was made that surprised everyone. Life? On a vast crystal floating 300 miles above the planet's surface? Impossible! But then we'd have thought the same if we had been the first to arrive on their world and found them down amidst the trees and rivers and so on. We learn a few things from this little bit here. So we get an idea of what the surface of the planet is like. So we're talking lava everywhere. So I think we get this across in the Monster Man picture here. It looks very red, very lava covered. So you get a lot of lava, but you also get trees and rivers. We're assuming, because the way Tumin talks there, implying that there are trees and rivers on this planet. We hear about these things called strangle vines, which I don't believe are ever mentioned again, at least not from what I read through. So that sounds very much like what they had on Lyra in the caves, where they had these snake-like vine things like whipping out. Similar name to strangle vines, and yeah, you can sort of imagine where they get that name from. So they were probably known to strangle living creatures. And speaking of living creatures, it's implied heavily here that there are creatures living down on this planet amidst the acid seas, the strangle vines and the lava flows. But it's non-intelligent life. So you'd probably assume very small creatures, probably largely microscopic creatures. Stuff that you could barely even call creatures, molecular life forms, that sort of stuff. So you're probably expecting that on the planet's surface. We also hear about these crystals, which on this picture, that massive thing there, these are large crystals, and they float above the surface. Now, I suppose we will look into the physics behind that, or try to briefly in a little bit. But for now, let's just live with the fact that these generationals, whatever they're called, came to this planet, had a look around, they saw acid seas, lava flows, small creatures, little stranglevine things, and thought, oh, it's like a almost prehistoric planet, you know, there isn't any intelligent life anywhere. It's a bit like Twitter. But yeah, then one of them, who's on an air skimmer, flies up and hits one of these crystals and finds the Ketrans, and that's the first encounter from Offworlders to these Ketrans. Before we move on to the crystal structures, let's wrap up a few more little bits of detail we get about the planet beneath the crystals. I opened my eyes and turned to look downward. Yes, we still floated high above the Enos lava swamp. Down and out of the matrix, out into the bare air beyond the reaches of the crystal, out into the bare air where I could look down and see the surface clearly, or as clearly as anyone could, given the yellow, slowly twisting swamp gas clouds down there. All at once my homeworld rose into view, huge, close. The familiar red rivers and grey-green morasses, the brown scarred deserts and puffy, pale green clouds, all lovely beyond enduring. We emerged into an oasis of sky, one of those wonderful clear holes that the bigger cloud banks sometimes develop. Our scientists are confident that at one time we did inhabit the surface of our world, or at least its less sulphurous seas. But at some point the symbiosis of Ketran and crystal formed and we simply grew together. So from these quotes we can gather a few things. There are sulphurous seas where the Ketran scientists believe that the Ketrans arose from. So they wouldn't have risen from like lava pools or anything like that, but sulphurous seas. They name certain features of the planet, even though they may be, as the book suggests, about 300 miles up. They still name features on the planet below them. So we got a name for one of the lava swamps, the Enos lava swamp, which we don't hear any more about. So don't worry, there's not going to be a separate AniLysis on the Enos lava swamp. We're covering it now. It's probably just an enormous lava swamp. Yes, that was something of an attempt at humour that didn't even come close, did it, really, honestly? But yeah, so they do name those water features. Maybe that there is the Enos lava swamp on this picture that Monster Man's drawn. We also get an image of this planet being very, very cloudy, and they talk about swamp gases filling the atmosphere, great big banks of clouds, and the occasional hole coming through that they find really beautiful, a nice weather feature. So yeah, lots of gas floating around, lots of clouds. Below is lava swamps and sulphurous seas. Basically a very inhospitable place. But then we mentioned the crystals. And Tumin says that the scientists believe that they formed a symbiotic relationship, which basically means give and take. Each benefits from becoming one. That's what that basically means. So let's go into the crystals, the more important part of Planet Ket, these crystals floating high above their world, on which the only intelligent life forms, the Ketrans, live. So let's talk about them. What is sure is that we cannot survive without the crystals, from which we derive our sustenance. And it is just as sure that though the crystals can grow without our help, they cannot survive intact long enough to become as vast as they are. The estimates are that a crystal above 1/2 mile in average circumference will crash. The atmospheric pressures and internal buoyancies will lose the battle to gravity at that point. Certainly the 79-mile circumference of the seed crystal is a result of Ketran symbiosis. How would the great crystals continue to float if not for the lift supplied by hundreds of thousands of Ketran wings? We would no longer be a planet of 32 independent crystals. We'd have all 32 hooked up to a planetary uninet. The age of my own home crystal, the equatorial high crystal, has been convincingly established as 1.4 million years. Of course, that's half the age of the seed crystal, making the EHC one of the newer fully formed crystals. Now we start to look into the physics of these things. There's a massive crystal structures, but they're not under the influence of gravity. until they reach about half a mile in circumference. I believe that was what I quoted there. Which is pretty big. But considering you look at the planet, and we're talking about vines and lava flows, seas, then there must be enough gravity there to be somewhat similar to Earth gravity. You know, give or take a few G's or whatever. I forget what gravity is measured in. But these crystals are floating high above the surface, so there must be something different to them. And I'm no physicist, so I can't really look too much into that. Maybe it's a job for one of the loyal fans out there to actually look into the physics of crystals and how they could possibly become buoyant. It does seem very, very strange, unless they're so far out of the off the surface. And this probably makes more sense. They're so far off the surface of the planet that the gravity is lessened. So I'm starting to figure it out now as we go along. Just forgive me. They're 300 miles up, apparently, which is a bloody long way. So yeah, this seems to make more sense now to me. Okay, so they're so high up that they're not as affected so much by the gravity. But there must be so little oxygen up there. So these Ketrans will have evolved to be very little dependent on, or they can survive in very little oxygen, very, very low air pressure as well, and all that sort of stuff, and cold temperatures and what have you. That's more for a Ketran AniLysis down the line. But maybe they float because they're so far up in the atmosphere and there's so little gravity. They're just that enough gravity. So almost like moons. So these crystals will be like moons, essentially, hovering around the actual planet Ket. So yeah, these crystals are moons, assuming I'm correct. But they measured it at, one of them, the EHC, Equatorial High Crystal, at being 1.4 million years. We also mention a seed crystal, which is assumed to be the oldest crystal that the Ketrans worked on or evolved on. I believe that's what it's getting at. We don't really get much detail into that, so that's down to speculation. Whether does that mean that the Ketrans have been around for 1.4 million years, maybe a bit more? Possibly. Their records must go back a bloody long time. Or maybe they were more primitive Ketrans, sort of like how humanoids were around. How far? Probably about 500,000 years ago, I think, you start to see proper humanoids coming up. It's still a long time, not as long as 1.4 million years, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, 500,000 years ago, you start to get very human-like creatures walk around, and they're not actual humans. They're not humans. Or whether... I'm talking hominids, basically. But human-like creatures have been around for quite a long time. Homo sapiens, not quite so long. So probably a similar story to the Ketrans, you know, like prehistoric Ketrans were on these crystals that long ago. Maybe they found etchings of Ketran life on these crystals, so they can say that is 1.4 million years old, etc., etc. There'll be some scientific process behind it that the Ketrans have figured out. Let's just put it at that. Okay, then move on. Move on, me. Oh yeah, and amidst all that rambling, there are 32 of these crystals, and that probably means there's 32 crystals that the Ketrans call home. So there probably are a lot of other smaller crystals, because we mention that crystals without Ketrans on can get up to about half a mile in size before crashing. So there's probably a lot of smaller, like clumpy crystals floating around, probably a lot. But it's only these massive big ones that the Ketrans consider, right, that's the Ketran city. There's 32 of those. The rest are just like little islands here, there, everywhere. So that's that. So let's get a few more descriptions about how these crystals look. What shape are they? Are there any growth or protrusions on these things? Well, I'm asking questions like this because, yes, it is the case, as we'll find out. Wings folded back and up. I dead dived through the masts and spars and rough-hewn new growth protrusions. From here I could get a fuller picture of my home crystal. It's terribly cliche to find it beautiful, but beautiful it was. It filled most of the sky, of course, but even from this distance I could see the generally spherical shape, the ball of brilliant reflective masts, spars and yards. The sun was up and shining bright, and as the crystal moved in a slow rotation, the sunbeams blazed, reflected from a million facets. Ice blue, palest green, yellow, violet and pink. It was a lovely sight. It was an omen, perhaps, of our own future, for it looked at first glance like a miniaturised version of the equatorial high crystal, except that the spars and masts were clearly not grown and trimmed to form a spheroid, but rather to form an elongated oval with a definite top and bottom. Firstly, another little trivial point in here. It's implied that there is one sun, which is pretty normal, you'd imagine, because most solar systems will revolve around a single sun. But you know, in a lot of sci-fis you have like multiple suns, like in Star Wars you've got multiple suns and what have you. So there's one sun to planet Ket, or for planet Ket, that Ket spins around. These crystals are spherical in form, but it's also implied there that that is deliberate, that the Ketrans actually mould this thing to be spherical rather than like all jagged and whatever, because they basically groom it, they like shave it, you know, get shaving foam on that bugger. But there's protrusions and masts and spars, and if you ever look at a crystal, like a proper volcanic crystal, it will have like jutting out bits of, I'll see if I can find a picture for you. Yeah, here you go. So this is what we talk about when we talk about like spars and masts and what have you. So this is quartz, and it doesn't form natural spheres. Although, of course, it was a large enough bunch of crystals that could be seen as spherical. But you get these massive jutting, very straight, jagged bits sticking out everywhere. So that is what the Ketrans are sort of latching onto. They're delving into these bits. But as this big city grows, these large crystals, they'll cut these down and make the general shape very much spherical. Of course, this is on a small scale. Oh, go away, crystal. So this is a bit bigger. So as a crystal grows, yeah, it forms this big mass of just these jutting, edgy bits. So imagine that, but it just keeps getting more and more crystals. It would form roughly a ball shape, but these Ketrans are probably just trimming off all these edges, keeping it nice and, you know, less like it's going to stab you. Has anyone ever like gone around stabbing people with a crystal like that before? Ah, stab you with a crystal. Ah, stab you with a crystal. The crystal stabber serial killer. Right, I'll write that into one of my fan fictions. We also get this sight of the sunbeams coming through these crystals and the brilliant colours. You sort of get the gist of it from this Monster Man picture here. Just colours everywhere. It's like Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. You know, orange and black and ochre and pink and ruby and olive and violet and freaking the next colour. That's actually I quite enjoyed that one. That's one of Andrew Lloyd Webber's good ones. That's quite a good story. It was red and yellow and green and brown, scarlet and black and ochre and peach and ruby and olive and violet. And I can't remember the next freaking one. Damn it. Not even sure if I got the others right, to be honest. So what happens to planet Ket? So we've gone over a general description. There isn't much more to how it's described in the Ellimist Chronicles, by the way. This book is where it comes from. What happens? Because Tumin obviously doesn't stay there forever. He eventually turns out becoming the Ellimist. So something must have happened for him to no longer be on Ket. Well, funnily enough, the Capizins come along after seeing the Ketrans with their little gaming consoles. And all they see is the games. It's like if human beings sent off Doom or GTA. all this other alien world saw was GTA. They're probably like, wow, this race is pretty scummy. And so they send the Capizins down and basically annihilate everything. Bye-bye crystals, bye-bye Ketrans. Nothing. The sky was empty. The sky that should have been filled with the equatorial high crystal, and all the tens of thousands of beating wings and happy faces, and all of it gone, leaving a soul-hollowing emptiness in the sky. Around the planet, station after station, orbit after orbit, race then slow, search an empty sky, accept the unacceptable with mounting horror. 12 crystals gone. They'll kill everyone. Everyone, won't they? Every crystal, one by one. Not us, I said harshly. Not if we run. Lack of her, we're it. We're all we have now. All of the Ketran race. Now reverse thrust. Do it. The Capucin ships didn't bother to pursue us as the MC and we two in the crate blew towards space. High above our lost, doomed planet, we rendezvoused with the MC and were accepted back inside the force field. It was the end of Ket, and, although there were still 72 Ketrans alive at that moment, it was also the end of my race. It's a very sad end to the Ketran race, effectively, as described here, and we can safely assume, that the entire Ketran race on the planet was eliminated. All of the crystals, at least all the big city crystals, were destroyed. I mean, theoretically, some Ketrans could have been away from those crystals, escaped the blast, and gone on to like some of the smaller crystals, like ones that are like, I don't know, 100 meters across, and started over again. But that's never hinted at. And Tumin, who eventually becomes the Ellimist, never speaks of the Ketrans again, which is why I say we can safely assume that all the Ketrans ended up dying. Even if some survived, maybe they just didn't have the resources or the skills, maybe they'd lost over the years, to survive, to start the race anew. So, what does that leave for Planet Ket, the one we're actually doing the analysis of? All the big crystals gone. Because no Ketrans around, they can't form those big crystals anymore. Whether that affects life on the planet's surface, I highly doubt. Unless, because these structures are so big, it affects the gravitation on the planet, we'd see some changes. But I don't think it would be drastic, personally. I think Planet Ket from this point on will just be like a proto-hospitable planet. Sort of like what they think Mars is now. Maybe not so much Mars, like Venus or something. So it's largely inhospitable. I don't think you'd have intelligent life develop on that planet for a very, very long time, which is sad. So that is what remains of Planet Ket, an essentially barren wasteland, lava fields, sulphurous seas, and the occasional microbes dotted around. A sad end to what was a thriving planet. But who knows? Maybe something else sprang there. Maybe I'm completely wrong. That's all up to speculation. But for now, that's been another analysis, and I'm sorry that I forgot to charge my little planet back here, because I should really have had it glowing like a planet. It would have been quite opportune, but whatever. Anyway, the next analysis will be on Mr. Edelman. I'm sure you all remember him, but he's going to be the next one. And I hope you've enjoyed this episode of analysis. We will cover more in-depth stuff with the Ketrans further down the line, but this has been purely on Planet Ket, the planet itself. Thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you next time. Ta-ra!